He saved an empire from the most feared invader history had ever produced. He was rewarded, not with gratitude, but with a blade, held by the very hand he had spent his life protecting. This is the story of the sword that turned on its own hand. Welcome to the Judas Archives. Turn down the lights. This one gets dark. We are taught that the greatest danger to a kingdom comes from outside its walls, from invading armies, from foreign kings. But history's coldest lesson is this: sometimes the empire's own throne fears its own defender more than it ever feared the enemy at the gates. Tonight, we return to the crumbling grandeur of the Western Roman Empire in its final desperate century to dissect the anatomy of a betrayal that helped seal Rome's own collapse, the murder of General Flavius Aetius by the very emperor he had spent his life defending. As a young man, Aetius had been sent as a diplomatic hostage, first to the Visigoths, then to the Huns themselves. Rather than breaking him, the experience forged him. He learned their warfare, their language, their loyalty structures, knowledge that would one day make him the most valuable general Rome had left. By his 30s, Aetius had risen to become the dominant military power in the Western Empire, commanding armies, negotiating with kings, and using his old connections among the Huns to hire mercenary forces when Rome's own legions grew too thin to hold the frontier alone. In 451 AD, Aetius faced his greatest test when Attila the Hun, the man history would call the Scourge of God, invaded Gaul with an army larger than Rome had faced in generations. At the Catalonian plains, Aetius, allied with his former enemies, the Visigoths, met him in one of the largest battles of the ancient world. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential victories in Roman history. Attila, the terror of two continents, was turned back. Aetius returned to Rome not merely as a general, but as the man who had single-handedly held back the collapse of the entire Western world. Rome celebrated him as a savior, but in the imperial palace, far from the cheering crowds, a very different reaction was quietly taking shape. The emperor, Valentinian III, watched his own general's popularity grow and felt something far colder than gratitude. Valentinian had inherited the throne as a child. He had never commanded an army, never won a battle, never earned the loyalty Aetius commanded so effortlessly. For years, Aetius had effectively ruled the Western Empire in all but name, and Valentinian, now a grown man, had grown tired of standing in his general's shadow. The Senate honored Aetius with titles and ceremonies befitting the man who had saved Western civilization. Valentinian sat through every one of them, applauding along with the rest, while quietly calculating just how much power one general had accumulated and how little of it technically belonged to the throne anymore. Aetius proposed a marriage between his son and the emperor's young daughter. On its surface, it was a gesture meant to bind their two families together. But to Valentinian, already suspicious of Aetius's ambitions, it looked like something else entirely. A general, quietly maneuvering his own bloodline onto the imperial throne itself. Inside the palace, a court chamberlain named Heraclius, along with a senator named Petronius Maximus, saw an opportunity in the emperor's growing paranoia. Neither man had Rome's best interests at heart. Both had their own reasons to want Aetius gone. Night after night, Heraclius planted the same quiet suggestion that Aetius intended to seize the throne entirely, that the marriage alliance was only the first step, that the general who had saved Rome now intended to rule it. Whether any of it was true no longer mattered. Valentinian had already begun to believe it. Valentinian, like Brutus centuries before him, found himself wrestling with a question dressed up as duty. Was protecting Rome from a general who had already saved it once itself a kind of patriotism, or was it simply fear, wearing a crown of justification? Heraclius delivered his final argument, that Aetius, during a recent financial dispute over unpaid soldiers, had spoken to the emperor with open disrespect. Proof, he claimed, that the general no longer feared consequences from the throne at all. Something in Valentinian finally broke. Aetius, meanwhile, suspected nothing. He had served 3 emperors, survived countless court intrigues, and considered Valentinian's occasional coldness simply the ordinary friction between a strong general and an insecure young ruler, not a genuine threat to his life. Petronius Maximus, for his part, had his own long, simmering resentments toward Aetius, dating back years. Whatever his private motives, he was more than willing to help convince the emperor that the general's death was necessary, and to help arrange exactly how it would happen. A summons was drafted, requesting Aetius's presence at the palace, ostensibly to discuss the unpaid soldiers' wages that had caused friction between them. It was, on its surface, an entirely ordinary piece of imperial business. Aetius had answered dozens of summonses just like it before. Aetius, seeing no reason for concern, traveled to the palace with only a small retinue. He had faced Attila the Hun on an open battlefield without fear. A financial meeting with an emperor he had served loyally for over 20 years was, to him, the least dangerous appointment imaginable. As was customary, Aetius left most of his guard at the entrance and walked the final stretch to the meeting chamber alone. It was a gesture of respect he had performed 100 times before. This time, it left him entirely without protection. The door closed quietly behind him. Aetius entered, bowing to the emperor as he had done countless times before. The room appeared entirely ordinary. The emperor, his chamberlain, a handful of attendants. Nothing suggested that this particular meeting had already been decided long before he walked through the door. They discussed the unpaid soldiers, the frontier's dwindling resources, the ordinary burdens of a crumbling empire, and then, mid-sentence, Valentinian rose from his seat and accused Aetius directly of plotting to seize the throne for himself. Aetius, stunned, began to protest his innocence. He had spent his entire life defending this throne. He had never, not once, moved against it. Before he could finish speaking, Valentinian, trembling, drew his own sword. The emperor, who had never won a battle in his life, struck the first blow himself against the general who had saved his empire. The attendants, following their emperor's lead, finished what he had started. The man who had turned back Attila the Hun died on the floor of his own emperor's chamber. According to the Roman historian Priscus, one witness in the room reportedly told the emperor something that would echo through history, that he had just cut off his own right hand, using his left. Valentinian had removed the one man capable of holding the crumbling empire together, and he had done it with his own 2 hands. Word spread quickly through the palace, and then through Rome itself. Aetius's soldiers, many of whom had served under him for decades, were left to process the fact that their commander had been murdered not by an enemy, but by the very throne he had died protecting. Rome did not celebrate. There was no relief, no sense of justice served. There was only a heavy, unspoken dread that the one man capable of holding back the collapse of the Western Empire was now gone, and that the throne itself had been the one to remove him. That night, alone in his chamber, Valentinian may have finally understood what he had actually done. He had removed the fear that haunted him, but he had also removed the one man standing between his crumbling empire and total collapse. There would be no undoing either. Within months, the practical cost of Aetius's death became impossible to ignore. The military structure he had spent decades building began quietly unraveling. The general's loyal retainers, robbed of their commander and their purpose, began quietly planning something of their own. Two of Aetius's former bodyguards, loyal to their murdered commander above all else, began quietly plotting their revenge. The emperor, who had struck down his own general, believing himself finally safe, had no idea the same fate was already being prepared for him. A little less than a year after Aetius's murder, Valentinian attended a military exercise on the field of Mars, believing the threat to his throne had long since been eliminated. He did not recognize the two men who approached him from the crowd. They were Aetius's former retainers. In full view of the assembled troops, they struck the emperor down, ending his life in almost exactly the same manner he had ended his general's. The hand that had cut off Rome's right hand had just been removed in turn. With both the general and the emperor dead within a single year, the Western Roman Empire was left with no strong leadership at exactly the moment it needed one most. Petronius Maximus, one of the men who had helped engineer Aetius's downfall, maneuvered himself onto the now empty throne. Within weeks, the Vandal king Genseric, sensing the empire's sudden weakness, sailed for Rome itself. The city that Aetius had spent his entire life protecting now stood without its greatest defender. At the exact moment its oldest enemies finally arrived at the gates. In 455 AD, Rome was sacked. For the second time in less than 50 years, historians have debated for over a millennium and a half whether the empire could have survived this moment had Aetius still been alive to defend it. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that the throne itself removed the one man who might have prevented it. Centuries later, the historian Edward Gibbon would call Aetius the last of the Romans, the final man capable of holding the Western Empire together through sheer force of will and loyalty. His death, at the hands of the very throne he protected, is still cited by historians as one of the moments that sealed Rome's fall. Much of what Aetius spent his life defending, the frontiers, the alliances, the fragile balance holding a crumbling empire together, unraveled within a generation of his death. A quiet, physical reminder of how completely a single act of paranoia can outlast the man who committed it. If you are sitting in the quiet tonight, having given everything to protect someone who saw your loyalty as a threat instead of a gift, remember this: the mind can always find a reason to fear the hand that protects it. The heart never forgets the weight of loyalty repaid with a blade. Two men, bound by a loyalty one of them could no longer trust, died within a year of each other, each felled by the very hand they should have been able to depend on. The empire fell, but the lesson somehow never has. Thank you for spending another night in the archives. If this story brought you comfort, please leave a broken heart emoji below and subscribe to join our quiet community. The archive is closing for now. See you next time. When the next dark stories unfold, you are not alone. Goodbye.